Hi everyone, welcome back to ISC Psychology. Let us start with a question. When most people hear the word psychologist, what do they picture? Probably someone sitting across from a patient on a couch and asking, how does that make you feel? That image isn't exactly wrong, but it captures maybe 5% of what psychologists actually do. Psychologists work in schools, in corporations, in courtrooms, in hospitals, in research labs, in the military, in sports teams, and in government. The field is enormous. Today's video will introduce psychology's major branches and explain how the field connects to other disciplines. It is one of the easiest chapters conceptually, but it is one where students lose easy marks by being vague. So we will focus on how to write precise, specific answers about each field and each disciplinary relationship. Before we go through the fields one by one, it is worth understanding why they exist at all. Psychology, as we've established before, is a scientific study of the behavior and mental processes. But human behaviors occur in a variety of contexts, in the childhood, in the workplace, in illnesses, in relationships, in various learning experiments. No single psychologist can be an expert in all of these, so over time the discipline naturally specialized. Think of it like medicine. There is one field called medicine, but within it you will have cardiologists, neurologists, pediatricians, and psychiatrists. Each problem specializes in a different context. Psychology works the same way. The ISC syllabus asks you to know 6 fields: clinical, counselling, developmental, educational, organisational, and social psychology. For each one, you need to know what kind of work psychologists in that field do. If you cover all the points we will go through across each subdiscipline in 3 or 4 lines each, you will get full marks. Clinical psychology is probably the most well-known field, and it is the one people most think of when they imagine a psychologist. Clinical psychologists work with people who are experiencing significant psychological problems: depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, eating disorders, trauma, or addiction. Their work involves assessment, figuring out what a person is experiencing and why; treatment, which involves various forms of psychotherapy. Clinical psychologists work in hospitals, psychiatric units, private practice, and rehabilitation centers. The key distinction to know here is that clinical psychologists are not psychiatrists. Psychiatrists have medical degrees and can prescribe medication. Clinical psychologists have psychology degrees and work through psychological methods, therapy, behavior change, or counseling techniques. Counseling psychology is closely related to clinical psychology but focuses on less severe difficulties. Where a clinical psychologist might work with someone with schizophrenia or severe depression, a counseling psychologist typically works with people going through difficult but not necessarily disordered experiences, like grief, relationship problems, career confusion, stress, low self-esteem, or adjustment to major life changes. The focus is on helping people cope, grow, and make better decisions, rather than treating a disorder. Counseling psychologists work in schools, universities, career guidance centers, NGOs, and private practice. A useful way to remember the difference between clinical and counseling psychology is that clinical deals with disorder and dysfunction, while counseling deals with difficulty and adjustment. Both involve talking therapies, but the severity of the presenting problem is different. Developmental psychology is the study of how human beings change across the lifespan, from infancy, childhood, adolescence, to adulthood and old age. Developmental psychologists study how thinking, emotion, language, personality, and social behavior develop and change over time. This field gave us some of the most important names in psychology, from Piaget's stages of cognitive development to Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. Developmental psychologists work in research, in child welfare organizations, in schools, in policy-making bodies that design programs for children, and in clinical settings that work specifically with children. Educational psychology focuses on how people learn and how that learning can be optimized. Educational psychologists study things like memory, attention, motivation, learning styles, the impact of classroom environment, and what makes teaching effective. This field sits at the intersection of psychology and education. Educational psychologists work in schools as specialists who assess students with learning difficulties, design curriculum, train teachers, and also develop educational programs. They also work in research institutions that study how learning happens. Organizational psychology, also called industrial psychology, applies psychological principles to the workplace. Organizational psychologists are interested in questions like how do we select the right person for the job? What motivates employees? How does leadership affect performance? How do you build effective teams? They work with companies, government organizations, and HR departments to improve productivity, employee well-being, leadership development, and organizational culture. This is one of the fastest growing fields in psychology because organizations are increasingly recognizing that human factors like motivation, morale, teamwork are central to performance. Social psychology is the study of how people think, feel, and behave in relation to other people. Things like what causes prejudice, how do we form attitudes, why do people conform. Social psychology gave us some of the most famous experiments in psychology, like Milgram's obedience experiments, Ash's conformity studies, and Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. You will cover several of these in detail in Class 12. Social psychologists work in research, in organizations designing public behavior change campaigns, in government policy, in advertising, and in conflict resolution. For your exam, questions might ask you to describe any one field or name all 6 with brief descriptions. The safest approach is to start with 2-sentence descriptions of each, followed by what it studies and where those psychologists work. This gives you everything you need for a 4-mark question on any field. This is a quick guide which will help you remember all the key points from the 6 subfields we discussed for your exams. Make sure to use this format while revising. Now, we come to the second major part of this chapter, psychology's relationship with other disciplines. Before we go through each one, let me explain the underlying logic of why this is important. Psychology studies human behavior and mental processes. Every other discipline also ultimately involves human beings, their decisions, their group behavior, their communication, their creativity, and their conflicts. So, psychology naturally interacts with all of them. The question here is just, how specifically does it interact with each one? Let's look at the first one, psychology's relationship with economics. Economics is fundamentally about how people make decisions about money, resources, goods, and services. Classical economics assumed people are perfectly rational decision makers. Psychology showed that that is not true. Psychological research on decision making, cognitive biases, and motivation has transformed economics. The entire field of behavioral economics, which apply psychological findings to economic behavior, emerged directly from this intersection. Psychologists like Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics for showing that human decision-making is systematic but predictably irrational. We make decisions based on emotions, mental shortcuts, loss aversion, and social comparison, not just pure logic. Psychology's relationship with political science is also interesting. Political science studies government power, political power, and policy. Psychology connects this in various important ways. Political psychologists study why people vote the way they do, how political attitudes are formed, how leaders persuade followers, and how propaganda works. Understanding obedience, attitude formation, and social influence are all important psychological concepts is very essential to understanding political behavior. Law and criminology is one of the most direct and fascinating intersections. Forensic psychology, which is the application of psychology to legal and criminal contexts, is an entire field in itself. Psychologists often assess the mental state of accused persons. They study criminal behavior, like what psychological factors led someone to commit crimes. They work on eyewitness testimony and also on rehabilitation to study what kind of psychological interventions could help convicted criminals reintegrate into society. Sociology studies society, social groups, social institutions, and social change. Psychology studies the individual. The overlap is the point where the individual meets the group. Social psychology, like we already discussed as a field, sits right at this intersection. It looks at questions like how does group membership shape individual identity? How do social norms develop? How do institutions like family shape personality? These are questions that require both psychological and sociological thinking. Computer science might seem like an unlikely partner for psychology, but the connection is deep and growing. Psychology has informed computing. The design of user interfaces, apps, and websites draws heavily on psychological research about perception, attention, memory, and decision-making. This is called human-computer interaction, or UX. When an app is designed to be intuitive and easy to use, the design is based on psychological principles. Computing has also informed psychology. Fields like artificial intelligence and computational models have given psychologists new ways to model cognitive processes. Mass communication, including journalism, advertising, social media, film, and television, is fundamentally concerned with influencing how people think, feel, and behave. This is a psychological enterprise. Aspects include advertising psychology, which looks at how messages are framed to persuade people. Media psychology, which studies the effect of media consumption on attitudes, emotions, and behavior. Lastly, research on social media has drawn on psychology of attention, addiction, social comparison, and self-esteem. These are questions on psychology, on how psychology is applied to communication contexts. Finally, music and fine arts. This might seem like the most surprising pairing, but it is a rich one. Psychology studies both the creation and reception of art. On the creation side, aspects include what psychological processes are involved in creativity. How does music composition draw on memory, attention, emotion, and imagination? On the reception side, questions include why does music affect our emotions? Why do certain compositions feel balanced and pleasing? The Gestalt laws of perception, which we discussed in the last video, were partly developed through the study of visual art. Music psychology looks at how rhythm, melody, and harmony are processed by the brain and why they produce emotional responses. So, as you can already see, psychology is important for several reasons. It helps us understand ourselves, our own motivations, emotions, and patterns of thought. It helps us understand others, why people behave the way they do, which builds empathy and reduces conflict. It contributes to mental health. Psychology gives us the tools to understand, diagnose, and treat psychological disorders. It contributes to society through education, organizations, law, and policy. Psychological knowledge makes institutions more effective and humane. And it is fundamentally a science. It develops our capacity for critical thinking, for evidence-based reasoning, and for questioning assumptions about human nature. A few exam tips to keep in mind. For the 6 subfields for psychology, don't just list names. 1 sentence of description per field is the minimum. The 2 fields students get most often mixed up in are clinical and counselling. Remember, clinical deals with disorder, counselling deals with difficulty. For the disciplines, 7 relationships is a lot to memorize, so focus on the specific connection for each. The word specifically is important. Don't write psychology helps political science understand people. This will only get you half marks. Instead, write about how psychology helps political science understand voting behavior, attitude formation, and the psychology of obedience to authority for a complete answer. One more thing. This chapter sometimes gets skipped by students who think it is just common sense. Don't make that mistake. It appears in 1 or 2 questions in almost every exam paper, and it is one of the easiest chapters to score full marks on if you've prepared it properly. That's all for today. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel ISC Psychology, and keep an eye out for the next video where we will discuss heredity and environment. Thank you for watching.